What's up everybody and welcome to a new video. In the previous video we built our first helper functions, and now in this video we're going to create the main game logic. And here we're going to start with the basics, and by that I mean cycling through the players, asking the player what column he or she wants to play, then executing a move and then checking if there is a winner. And here I want to first show you how we are going to cycle through the players. Namely, for the players we're going to create a list. And since that list is not going to change, we're going to make this a constant. So we're going to say players equals a list. And the players that we're going to use are simply an X and then an O. So then to index this list, we need an index. So we're going to say current index equals 0. And now to show how we're going to cycle through those players here, I'm simply going to use a for loop. So I'm going to say for underscore in range 10. And then here, the first thing that we're going to do is to specify the current player. So we're going to say current player equals players brackets and then current index. Then we're going to print out that player. So we're going to say print current player. And then after that, we have to update our current index here. So we're going to say current index equals 1 minus the current index. So what's happening here is if the index is currently 0, then this calculation here is 1 minus 0. So therefore then the result is 1. And if the current index is 1, then this calculation here is 1 minus 1. So therefore then the result is 0. So therefore then we can cycle through these players. So if I run this, then you can see that we cycle here through X and O. So this is how we're going to cycle through the players. So therefore let's copy this constant here into our helper functions.py file, and then we can start working on the game logic in this game.py file. So first we're gonna import here helper functions. So we're gonna say import helper functions as hf. Then we're gonna create first our grid here with this function. So we're gonna say grid equals hf dot create grid, and then we're gonna print that out. So we're gonna say hf dot show grid. And then after that, we're going to create some game variables. So the first one that we're going to create is the current index. So we're going to set that equal to 0. And then we're also going to create a Boolean flag, which we call game active. And we set that to true. And then we're going to say while the game is active, we want to play our game. So the first thing that we want to do is that the player should be able to choose a column. So therefore, let's create here a comment, and then say choose a column. And then here we first again have to specify who the current player is. So we're going to say current player equals hf dot players brackets current index. And then we can ask the current player what column he or she wants to play. And that's stored in a variable called column. And then here we're simply going to use the import function. And we create here a prompt, which is going to be an f string. And here we say player and then placeholder current player. And then we're going to ask what column do you want to play. And then once we have that column, we have to make then an adjustment. Namely, this import function here returns a string. However, our function here works with integers. So we have to transform this column here into an integer. So we're going to say column equals int column. And then one more adjustment that we have to do is to say -1. And that's because the player is going to specify a column between 1 and 7. However, in Python, we have a 0-based index. So therefore, then we have to make this adjustment here. So let's also create a comment for that. So let's say here adjust for 0-based index. And then once we have our column, we can then execute the move. And therefore we're going to use here this make move function. So here then we're going to say grid equals hf dot make move, where we put in the grid the current player and then also the column. And then after the move was made, we want to again show the grid. So we're going to say hf dot show grid. And then once the move has been made, we then want to check if there is a winner. So we're going to say check the game state, and therefore then we're going to use this is for connected function. So we're going to say if HF is for connected, so if there are 4 dots connected, then there is a winner. So we're going to print that. So we're going to say print, and here again use an F string, and then say player placeholder current player has won, and then the game is over. So we're going to set this game active variable equal to false. So we're going to say game active equals false. And if there's not a winner, so if there are not 4 dots connected, then we simply want to switch to the next player. So therefore then we have to update our current index here. So we're going to say current index equals 1 minus the current index. And that's already our game. So now let's see if that is working. So let's run this game.py file in the terminal, python game.py. And then here, as you can see, the grid is printed, and then player X is asked, what column do you want to play? So let's pick column 1. So then the move is made here on column 1, and then we ask player O, what column do you want to play? So let's pick column 2. So then again, the move is made, and again, player X is asked. So we are cycling through the players. So now let's make a couple of moves. So now here in the next move, player X can win. So let's see if that is working. So let's here pick column 1 and then see what happens. And then here, as you can see, it says now player X has won. So the game, and then the game also stopped. So our code is working. And then one small thing that I would like to change about this is here after this statement player X has won, I would like to have another empty line. So therefore, I'm simply adding here a new line character. So now let's see if that is working. So let's just make the same moves again. So now here player X can win. And then it says here player X has won. And then there is here this empty line. So as you can see, our code is working. So therefore then here in our to-do list, we can check off this first point in this to-do list. Then the next point on our list is called input validation. Namely, what I would like to do is to validate here this input that we are getting from the player. Because currently we are not doing that. So if the player doesn't provide a number between 1 and 7, then that will break our game. So for example, therefore to show that, let's run the game again. And then here, let's provide, for example, an 8. And then here, if I run this, then you can see this breaks our game. And in fact, if we provide anything other than a number between 1 and 7, then this will break here our game. And I would like to make sure that that can't happen. So therefore, let's create here another comment. And here we're going to say check user input. And the way that we're going to achieve that is simply by specifying a list of valid columns, of all the columns that are valid to play. And I've already prepared that. So here, this is another constant. So this is simply called valid columns. And here I've specified all the columns that are valid to play. So now here in our code, we can simply then say if column not in hf dot valid columns, then we want to continue. So then we jump up back here in our while loop, and then the players ask again what column he or she wants to play. And then here we can additionally also provide some information. So we can print the input must be a number between 1 and 7. And then here I would also like to add a new line character. So now let's see if that is working. So if we run the game again and then here provide an 8, then you can see now it prints the input must be a number between 1 and 7, and then player X is asked again what column he or she wants to play. So if I, for example, provides just anything else, then we get here the same message. So our code is working. So therefore then we can check off here the next point in our to-do list. Then the next point on our list is to check if the column is already full, because currently we're not doing that, and that can also break our game. So to demonstrate that, I've prepared here this grid. So let's paste this. So here we have these two full columns. So now let's run the game again to see what happens if we play one of those columns. So let's play here column 1. And in this case, then we get an error, and this breaks again our game. So here we have a type error because num_type object is not iterable. So what's happening is that here in this make_move function, this if statement here is never triggered because we don't have here an empty cell in this column, and therefore then this function returns none. So now to make sure that that doesn't happen, let's add here another comment or another section in our code. So let's say here check if column is full, and then here we're going to create another helper function. So to do that, let's go here to this notebook. So let's paste again here this grid, and then the function is going to be called is column full, and then here we put in the grid and the respective column that we want to play. So then here the first thing that we're going to do is to access here this top row, because if we want to check if the column is full, then we are only interested in the top row. So we're going to say here top row equals grid brackets 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return the following. So we're going to say top row brackets column to get the respective column. And then we're going to say that this should not be equal to the empty cell that we have here defined. So therefore then let's also paste here this empty cell into the notebook. So here then what should happen is the following. So if this field here is not an empty cell, then this comparison here is true. So therefore then this function returns a true. If it is an empty cell, then this comparison is not true and the function returns a false. So let's see if that's the case. So let's go and say here is column full and then grid. And then let's first check here column 1. So that has index 0. So this should return a true. So let's see if that's the case. That's the case. So it's working. Let's now go to column 2. In this case, we get here a false. So that's also working. And now let's also check again column 3, so which has then index 2. And here again, we get a true. So this function is working. So let's copy it into our helper functions.py file. And then in our game.py file, what we can say is if hf.is column full, and then we put in here the grid and the column. Then again, we simply want to continue. And here we can also provide some information. So we're going to create here again an f string, and that is going to say column and then a placeholder and then column +1, again to adjust for the zero-based index. And then we can say is already full. And then here again, let's add a new line character. So now let's see if that is working. So let's run the game again. So let's try to play column 1 again. So let's say here 1. And then as you can see, it says column 1 is already full and player X is asks again what column he or she wants to play. So let's play column 3. Now it says that column 3 is full. So now let's just play column 2 here to see if that is still working. And as you can see, now we made our move and now player O has to choose a column. So this is working. So therefore then we can check off here the next point in our to-do list. Then the next point in our list is to check for a draw. Namely, the game can not only be finished if there is a winner, but it can also be finished if there is a draw. And currently we don't have a check for that. So therefore then our game breaks again. So to demonstrate that, I have prepared here this grid. So let me copy and paste that. So here we only have this one column left to play. So now let's see what happens if we play that column. So here then we can play column 4. And then after that, player O is asked what column he or she wants to play. And since all those columns here are full, we're only getting here the response that the respective column is already full. So we are stuck in this loop here. So therefore then let's interrupt this game here. And then here in our code, let's add a check for the draw after the check here for the win. And what we need to do here is we need to simply check here this top row. Namely, if there's an empty cell in the top row, then the board or the grid is not full yet and we can make a move. If on the other hand, there's no empty cell, then the grid is full and then there's a draw if there's not a winner. So therefore then, after the check for the winner, what we're going to do is here say top row equals grid brackets 0. And then we're going to check if hf dot empty cell is not in this top row, then we're going to have a draw because there's no winner. So therefore then we can here print something to the terminal. So we're going to say the grid is full and then it's a draw. And then here let's also add this new line character. And then after that we're also going to set the game active variable equal to false. So now let's see if that works. So let's run the game again. So then let's play column 4 again. And now it says here the grid is full, it's a draw. So the code is working. However, since we are now having here this statement here twice, so game active equals false, I would like to put this code here into its own helper function. So we're going to call this function simply is game over. And here we put in the grid. And first we're going to do the check for the winner. So therefore we're simply going to copy this part here of the code. So let's paste it into this function. And then here we don't need this hf dot anymore. And then here, as you can see, for this function, for this game over function, we also need to know what the current player is. So let's add that as a parameter. So that's the check for the winner. And then if there is a winner, then this function should simply return true. And then after that, we're going to add the check for the draw. So therefore then let's copy this part of the code and paste it into here. Again, we don't need here this hf dot anymore. And then here we're also gonna return this true if there's a draw. And then lastly, if those two if statements here are not triggered, then the function should return a false because then the game is not over yet. Okay, so now let's use this is game over function in our code here. So therefore then here we can delete this and then here simply say is game over and we put in the grid and the current player. And then we set the game active variable equal to false. So that part here of the code we can then delete. And then here one thing that I forgot earlier was to add here a comment that simply says switch player. Okay, so now let's see if that code is working. So therefore let's run the game again. So now here let's play column 4 again. And again we get a message that the grid is full, it's a draw. So now let's see what happens if there's actually a win. So therefore let's make this O here into an X. And then let's run the game again to see if that works. So now if you play column 4, it then says player X has won. So the code is working. And therefore then we can here check off our next point in this to-do list. And then the last point in our to-do list is to ask to play again. So currently the way that our game is structured is that if we play a game and then the game ends, then the game simply stops. And if we want to play again, we have to run the fire again. And I would like to structure it in such a way that the game actually asks the player if he or she wants to play again. So therefore we go here into this block of code where we check if the game is over. And then here we want to ask if the player wants to play again or not. So therefore we're going to create here a variable called answer. And this is the result of this import function. And here the prompt is simply going to be, do you want to play again? And then the answer should be yes or no. And then if that answer is no, then we're gonna set the game active variable equal to false. Otherwise, what we're gonna do is we're gonna reset the game variables. So reset the game variables. And for now, we're just going to reset the grid. So we're going to say grid equals hf.create grid. And then we also want to show the grid again. So we're going to say hf.show grid. So now let's see if that is working. So let's run the game again. Then here, let's play column 4. And then now it says here player X has won. Do you want to play again? And we're going to say yes. And then here we have our new empty grid. And then player X is asked what column to play. So now if we go through this game, then we can see one problem with this code. Namely, if we now play again, then again player X here is going to start. So the way that the code currently is, that means that the player X is always going to start. So that's not fair. So we would like to add a functionality that also switches between the different players in between games. So therefore, let's here interrupt this game. So now let's do that. To do that, namely, we have to add here, or we have to keep track of the starting player. So we have to create here a new variable. So we're going to call this starting player. This is going to be equal to hf.players and then brackets current index. And then here in this part of the code, what we're going to do is to check if the starting player is equal to the current player. So if that's the case, then we want to switch it around. So for example, if the starting player was player X and player X also made the last move, then we want to switch that around. And then in the next game, player O should be starting player. So therefore then we need to update here then the current index. And then afterwards, we're going to update here our starting player. So we're going to say starting player equals hf.players brackets current index. And the current player we don't need to update because this is going to be updated here at the beginning of the while loop. So let's now see if that works. Therefore, let's run the game again. So let's here play column 4. Player X has won. Do you want to play again? Yes. And now player O should start. And as you can see, player O is starting. So let's also go through this game here to see if in the next game player X then starts. So let's say yes. And as you can see, player X is starting. So let's also quickly go through this game to see if it still works. And here, as you can see, player O is now starting. So our code is working. And we could leave it like this. However, I would like to put this code here into its own helper function. So therefore, we're going to create a new helper function. And we're going to call this ask play again. And here the parameters for this function are going to be the game variables. So we're going to need a game active variable. We're going to need the grid. We're going to need to know about who the starting player was. We need to know who the current player is. And then lastly, we also need to know what the current index is. So those are the parameters for this function. And then here for the function itself, we can simply copy this code here. So let's copy and paste that. So let's unindent that. And then here, obviously, we don't need this hf anymore. So let's get rid of that. And then at the end, what this function should do is it should return all the variables that we assign here in this function. So we're going to need to return here the game active variable. We're going to need to return the grid. We're going to need to return the starting player. And we're also going to need to return here the current index. And again, the current player we don't need to return because this is going to be determined here at the beginning of our while loop. So this is now our function. So let's use that here in our code. So here where we're going to say, is the game over? We're going to call this function. So we're going to say, or we're going to simply copy here these return values and then say that should be equal to hf.ask play again. And then we have to put in here all those parameters. But Then, however, you can see that we have here this extremely long line. So to get around that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to put those parameters here into another variable, and we call this params. So those are then our parameters. And then we're simply going to unpack this params variable into our function call here. So this is now what the code looks like. So let's see if that is working. So let's run the game again. So let's play column 4, then player X is 1. Let's play again to see if that works. And as you can see, we get your new grid and player O is now starting. So let's now just quickly go through this game again to see if player X starts then in the next game. And as you can see, player X is starting. So our code is working. So therefore then we can here get rid of this grid. And this is now our final code for the game. So if we go back to our to-do list here, we can now check off here this as to play again point. And therefore then we have created all the game logic. And with that, then we have created all the game mechanics. So we've reached the end of this video. And then in the next video, we're gonna work on the AI opponent. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.